Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 edition of our series Fintech Fridays, brought to you by BDO Australia. My name is Tim Aman. I'm BDO's Global Fintech Leader, as well as the National Financial Services Leader. Before we kick things off, I would just like to quickly draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that is currently showing on the screen. To start, you are all automatically muted, but we'll be accepting questions throughout the session, and you can submit these using the question tab. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. However, if we cannot respond to your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar concludes. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please click on the support button, which is one of the bottom tabs on your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing the slides, a link to the recording, access to register for future sessions, and the speaker contact details for all of us. For the advancement of the fintech ecosystem, a large part of it relies on the support of government initiatives, whether it be tax relief, grants, and incentives, or other regulation. With a new financial year upon us and a number of recent federal budget measures being handed down, there are a combination of smaller, new, extended, or expanded initiatives aimed at providing more favorable conditions for entrepreneurs and early stage businesses, particularly for fintechs. As many of you probably would have seen earlier this week, there was a global report that came out on the competitiveness of fintechs. And Australia placed 6th on that competitive league table, which is a fantastic result. And 2 of the cities in Australia are in the top 25, with Melbourne being 25th and Sydney being 11th. So a fantastic result, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve that on the global scale. Today, to discuss the main changes impacting fintechs and what they mean in the year ahead, I'm joined by 2 excellent panelists to help unpack this topic. We welcome back Piper Alderman digital law partner Michael Bacina. Michael is a well-respected in the fintech space as both a lawyer and a former developer and founder of a startup. Michael has a rare combination of technical, regulatory, and legal skills, which he leverages to assist his clients. We also welcome to our Fintech Friday panel for the first time fellow Rooster fan Graham Wakeman, BDO's Government Incentives Partner. Graham has a reputation for providing leading-edge advice on how to access and maximize business entitlements, specializing in the R&D tax incentive and export market development grants. Good morning and welcome both.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start to begin and analyze the budget for fintechs. While there are no specific dedicated initiatives in the budget, there were a number of changes which will make conditions more favorable for fintechs. Michael, from your perspective, what do you think in the recent budget announcements will have the best outcomes for fintechs?
Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for tuning in this morning. Look, it's really exciting to see the amount of money that has been committed by the federal government in this budget, specifically in the digital space. It's really heartening. Previous budgets did not have anywhere near as much of a focus, and I think we've seen with the rise of COVID in the last 12 months, many years of digital transformation in businesses rammed into a really short period of time. So, whether it's the funding of blockchain pilots that's come from this budget, with 2 specific pilots being funded, we've got over $50 million for a national artificial intelligence center to help drive that space. We've got Jane Hume's office pushing out the digital roadmap as well. The Next Generation AI Graduates Program I think was funded for almost $25 million. There's I think 36 grants coming out in AI as well. There's just a whole lot more money coming out. The consumer data right initiatives that are moving to bring it beyond just open banking to really give consumers power, that might be something that's going to really be of interest to a lot of fintechs as they start to have a level of being able to get accredited and get access to that data and really bring comparisons to the forefront. The example I always give, and it's coming to energy soon, is no one can understand an electricity bill. I can't. I've got several degrees, and being able to let computers and machines do that assessment for us is really exciting. So this is the gearing up. We'll see the benefits in the next few years, I think, of unleashing some amazing creativity from all this funding.
Yeah, Michael, I think, and I'll talk a little bit more, I know, when we get to the regulatory section, because I know you're quite passionate about, things like blockchain and crypto. So we'll talk about that, a little bit more. Graham, I guess, from your perspective, the budget lowered the company tax rate. What's your view in terms of how this compares with other global corporate tax models?
Thanks, Tim. It's reassuring that the government's pursuing the declines, the legislated declines in company income tax. It's clear that whilst there's been some interruption with the pandemic, the whole globalisation and the digitisation is going ahead, and it is really important going forward that we have a competitive regime, and I think the budget's really consolidated that position. There's nothing like a pandemic to lead to some really positive industry policy decisions. It's been very good.
Yeah, I think, and again, we'll talk a little bit in terms of, I think in some ways COVID-19 has allowed people to focus on a lot more things. There's been a flurry of activity when you get to regulation that's happened over the last 12 months. So, I mean, obviously, I know you guys are back there in Sydney in lockdown. So I think we thought we were done with COVID. It looks like it's obviously reared its ugly head a little bit and in a little bit of a pause, but hopefully we'll get out of lockdown in Australia quite quickly. So Graham, I guess, we just started the new financial year. Is there anything specifically that you think fintech should be focusing on immediately now in terms of assessing their affairs?
I think the most immediate thing is to take avail themselves of the advantages provided in things like the instant write down. So if there's any capital expenditure that needs to be done, then now's the time to do it. Lots of clients are really bringing forward capex in order to avail themselves of the instant write down. It's an excellent incentive to invest, and the timing's great.
Okay. So Maddie, if you want to put up on the screen, there's a polling question we have for the audience in terms of, what are the key changes announced in the budget are you most keen to hear about today? And we'll let people sort of select this, and then hopefully we'll weave this into the conversation that we have for the next sort of 45 minutes or so. But while the poll is going through, Michael, is there something that from the budget, looking down this list here, that sort of jumps to your forefront that you're most excited about?
Oh, look, I think that I don't specifically specialize with intellectual property other than how it interfaces with tech companies, but the patent box regime sort of is a dipping the toe in the water of being able to put really specific favourable tax treatment for IP that's remaining in Australia, which is something that I think is it's not going to be immediately available to fintechs unless they're in the medical biotech space. But I think that's a really exciting development, aside from all the in the other category with all the cool crypto and blockchain stuff. So I think the patent box regime is the one I'd pick.
Okay, Graham, I might know what you might pick, but what excited you most about it?
Well, I'd like to endorse what Michael just said. I'm an R&D tax junkie, but the patent box regime was the thing that excited me the most. And I know it has no relevance whatsoever to the fintechs at the moment. It's confined to biotech and medical, but this is just a step in the right direction, and it's a step in the right direction that really needed to take place. It's been the missing link in that kind of intellectual property technology development regime for the last 30 years. We've got a good incentive system to encourage the creation of intellectual property, but the missing link has been that and various committees and reviews and whatever. It's that transition to commercialization, and this patent box regime provides the opportunity to consolidate the location of successfully completed intellectual property in Australia and have the commercialisation and the further development anchored in this country, which is a very, very important development. And the government in its statement did say, left it open to expand the regime. I very much hope that the patent box regime will establish itself as a real foundation of our industry development policy initiatives.
So unfortunately for the two of you, that's the third choice from the crowd. And Graham, you'll be pleased to know, as a R&D junkie, yours is number one with 40%. So I guess for those that are listening, we'll look to cover these topics over the next 45 minutes. So Matt, if you want to take down the polling question. Why don't we jump a little bit into regulation? You know, as I mentioned before, it's been a lively year over the past 12 months during the pandemic in terms of a lot of activity on a lot of fronts. And then, Michael, I think, you know, you've been working with different committees. The Senate committee has begun the last phase of its inquiry and trying to continue to focus on removing barriers to Australian growth as a technology and finance hub. What do you think, from your perspective, are the key areas that are going to be tackled in this last phase of the inquiry?
Well, Tim, the inquiry's major focus, they put out a press release when they changed their name to the somewhat mouthful of Senate Select Committee on Australia as a Technological and Financial Centre. Previously it was, you know, referred to as the Fintech RegTech Committee in short form. Now we don't have a really good short name for it, but the major areas that the committee's dealing with and will be dealt with in their final report is the digital asset regulatory framework, which so many regulators around the world are looking at as this space continues to grow. And it's interesting to note that earlier this week, ASIC issued CP343, which is a consultation on digital assets being used in listed products, ETPs and ETFs specifically, because we've seen, I think there's 19 ETFs with digital assets on the Canadian Stock Exchange. There's none in America, but people are trying, and there's none in Australia, but also people are trying here. So ASIC has started engagement around that. But on the committee side, it was looking at the digital asset framework. They've also said they want to really examine the problem of debanking, not just in crypto and blockchain, but that issue has been a really big problem for digital currency exchanges in Australia. I'm not sure there's a single exchange that hasn't been debanked at some point. And there's obviously a lot of frustration there, but it's also something that we've seen around the fintech space more generally. So we've seen businesses that are involved in payments or other innovative approaches suddenly getting no reason debanking, which is massively disruptive to their businesses. So the committee has promised to gather evidence on that and see what can be done to try and address that, which is a really challenging one to solve when there's a lack of information as to why banks are doing it. Obviously, people, you know, there's the banks are afraid and they don't want to support competitors' side of the equation, through to the, you know, genuine money laundering concerns or concerns about risk and issues with consumers on that end. And the third major area the committee is looking at is where the Corporations Act and laws are prohibiting or discouraging investment in Australia, which is also a fairly broad aspect to be looked at by the committee, and a lot of submissions will be dealing with that. So many different things that could be tweaked, and we'll touch on some of those issues a bit later on. So a fairly broad remit. We're looking for a really interesting report. It's a kind of report that only comes around, you know, once every 5 years or so. So there's a lot of people really pushing to try and make this count and get some changes through that will help position Australia to be much more competitive in the technological space. And we really punch above our weight when it comes to fintechs, you know, with the Afterpays and Zip of the world being out there, and even in the DeFi world in crypto land of the global projects, a huge number are Australians. So we really do that classic Aussie thing of battling our way to the top of the pack given our size, and so hopefully these kinds of approaches will help maintain that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, because as I mentioned in the beginning, with that global fintech competitiveness league table, with Australia sitting 6th, which is a fantastic result. And I guess sometimes when we're within Australia, we think regulation's not moving quick enough, but yet, you know, from a global perspective, you know, we're still, you know, sort of a top 10. So that is, you know, so I think it's a great opportunity, I think, over the next sort of 12 months, if we can sort of continue to improve regulation, you know, and I guess if you look at crypto assets, obviously it's quite topical. You know, how will they be regulated? You know, one thing is, you know, what is the committee sort of looking for in terms of overseas countries that are, I guess, more cutting edge in terms of pertaining to how crypto will be regulated?
I think the committee is definitely looking for overseas examples. Australian, you know, regulatory approaches to things often might be considered a fast follower, which is not a bad place to be, because you can learn from the approach that overseas jurisdictions have taken and try to avoid the pitfalls that they kindly fell into first. So Singapore is always looked at closely, because Singapore as a financial center is a competitor to, say, Sydney and Melbourne. there are other, obviously Brisbane's rising as well, but really there's a core view on the Sydney, Melbourne financial hubs and Singapore competing against each other, particularly with a lot of outflow happening from Hong Kong. So the businesses leaving there and really looking for homes are often considering Singapore and Sydney or Melbourne. So looking at what's happening there, even seeing how banking is being revolutionized with digital assets in America, with new banks emerging that are specifically trying to cater for these digital assets that haven't had a regulated custody arrangement in place before. Over in the US, Wyoming is a standout. There's several chartered banks that have emerged with this really interesting framework to try and deal with previous problems, because to my knowledge, no licensed custodians in Australia, certainly no banks, will purport to hold digital assets on behalf of someone and have them in any kind of insured way, which is a real blocker, because when you can't have that product held securely, you create concerns and uncertainty, and the myths around risk continue. Whereas once something is in a bit more of a regulated space, and I think they'll really focus on digital custody. There's a large chunk of consideration of digital asset custody in ASIC's consultation paper released earlier this week. And that has fairly sensible guidelines, I think, that they've proposed around making sure that if somebody is holding someone else's assets, they are meeting a standard to keep them safe. And that's not novel, but it's just without a framework in place, you won't see custodians and others be doing that, versus, say, the US, the comptroller of the currency issued a letter last year saying, we don't have an issue if banks want to hold stable coins, and saying there's a way to do this. And that can give comfort to existing financial players to say, oh, okay, we should actually have a division that's dealing with this. And you're seeing the larger investment banks have wealth divisions arising around digital assets. So they're already getting their toe in the pool, or in some cases diving straight in. Goldman Sachs is a really good example of doing a 180 from a few years ago, of saying, like, this is a nothing, it'll all go away, to having a whole wealth division rising up to say, well, actually our clients want this, therefore we will have services that can help meet their needs. But everything starts from custody. My view is that is a massive opportunity to solve, and that can put Australia ahead of several other jurisdictions which are kind of dealing with custody, but really clear rules that see Australian licensed custodians coming in and saying, yep, we can sort this out in partnership with businesses that have the technological skills to do it and keep them safe, means that people don't need to try and get their head around private keys and the risks and the security that goes with that. They can get to a point of saying, like, this is safe, we can do it, and that helps the adoption massively. And helping the adoption helps drive it through all parts of the I suppose just fintech generally and the financial services industry.
And I think there's going to be, that digital custody and maintaining that asset. I guess there's obviously the question of, is it an asset or inventory? Which I know is, which will probably be, the US is still going through that exercise. But assuming that we get to the point where it's considered an asset and there's custody, then, as you and I know we spoke before, in terms of licenses, AFSLs, there's going to be, an uptick of what do we need to do on AFSLs, because right now, crypto, for example, typically isn't necessarily, that slows things down in terms of getting a license. So you can sort of see there's going to be playing some catch up in terms of people adding that particular product to their license as well.
That's right, and the easiest one is, the ETP ETFs, right? So those are probably the first products we'll see, because they can put that regulated wrapper on top in exactly the same way as an ETF for oil or wool or something. You don't need to worry about how the wool or oil is being secured. If it's a commodity-based ETF, then you can simply get exposure to that price. That's the simplest path to wider adoption in terms of people buying into these things, and we've certainly seen that in Canada. The inflows into those ETFs have been very significant, and so I expect we're going to see that first, but that kind of digital custody is really important as we see more and more use of things like non-fungible tokens to record things, because there's no reason why share certificates, which particularly in smaller companies are sadly in many cases an afterthought or sort of dealt with as an annoying compliance piece, can't go properly purely digital in a blockchain secured way, which is just better for everyone in a permissioned state. It's a little bit nerdy, but we want to get the nerd part away, so that it's like, we could deal with it if you guys, and then people at the end of the day, shareholders and businesses, can say, we don't need to worry about that. It's taken care of. We've got the professionals to sort that out. Let's focus on our business. That's the goal. So at the moment, there's still that piece of a lot of the technological edge is bumping up against things. If people want to get involved, we want to get rid of that.
Okay. You mentioned before about the, I know you're involved in the national blockchain roadmap, and you talked about the pilot projects. Can you just explain a little bit more in terms of some of the use cases that are going to be part of the pilot?
So they're focusing in on supply chain for the most part, which is a really, sensible, not at all related to crypto whatsoever. It's just about tracing goods as they go through. So one of the pilots is focused on making sure the excise on beverages is properly calculated and recorded, which is really important because that is a massive, painful job for those industries dealing with excise payments. So having that recorded clearly in a way that's traceable and essentially fraud-proof is a massive win-win. So that supply chain focus, I think, is really deliberate and sensible because it's a huge gain. You've seen some fantastic, projects come out of Australia. I think the oldest is probably Agri-Digital, and there's quite a few other ones that have focused on the agricultural space about making sure that things can be tracked all the way through, and that there can be confidence around what's being delivered. There's already huge amounts of money that have been spent in very bespoke and proprietary systems that will do that for people and leave them very heavily reliant on certain levels of centralized servers. And there's the biggest advantage of these things going into a blockchain system is that self-healing network and automatic redundancy, which comes into play. And I think that when businesses realize how powerful that is around supply chain management, that unleashes a huge amount of value. So focusing government funds into these kinds of pilots that can really unlock benefits is fantastic. And we've seen also in the last couple of days, I think it was 181 million. We had this a CRC funded with a lot of industry participants as well, that's going to be focusing a bit more on financial services and potentially central bank digital currencies. So significant money going into figuring out how we can take advantage of these digitally scarce items that previously never existed, and we can now do really amazing things with them in a purely digital world, and really get cost savings and security savings and fraud savings to really eliminate costs there, which is that's super exciting to me around that funding. So really excited to see how those come forward in the next couple of years and that we see good results from there. And I'd be remiss in not also shouting out the ASX's recent announcement, nothing to do with the budget, but really bringing their blockchain project to the fore and saying they're going to be opening it up for other people to build in their permissioned space with really interesting crossover potential and data sharing. The data sharing is just extraordinary on something like that with a business like ASX.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a bit of a game changer because I work with a lot of broker dealers, etc. So it's going to be exciting times on that front. Last piece of regulation, probably pre-COVID, Royal Commission was raging along. And do you think that Royal Commission is going to come back to the forefront, I guess, in terms of issues for the financial services and fintech sector?
Oh, look, it's I've been caught up so much with all of the blockchain regulation and stuff. The Royal Commission's almost faded a little bit. I think the recommendations were so serious, and the things that came out of that commission were big problems, and they're going to take years to solve in some cases. So it's always going to be there. It's got crossover, particularly with things like talent visas and whatnot that need to be addressed because COVID's created this really sharp and serious problem of talent. We keep hearing anecdotal stories of real wage pressures, even in professional services firms, because we don't have that pool of people coming in who traditionally would, that were highly skilled and needed. We're getting brought in specifically, but I do think it's going to still be very relevant for a very long time. We don't have that kind of Royal Commission stuff very often, so I think it'll still be relevant.
Yeah, I think in again, on some of the larger financial services clients that we work with, Royal Commission is still very much on the forefront. I think it probably hasn't cascaded down to the wider financial services sector. So I think it's going to be quite interesting to sort of see how that comes back into play. You touched a little bit about the visa arrangements, and I think that's going to be quite important in terms of, for us to remain competitive, we need to have that influx, of talent. And I think from an Australian perspective, obviously, we're further ahead than other countries in terms of COVID. I think probably the quicker we can get people in, we're going to have a lot of people that want to come down here. So hopefully we're going to see some significant inflow of people once we get through this latest bit of lockdown.
Absolutely.
Let's now, I think you guys talked a little bit about the patent box regime, and I know both of you guys were quite excited about that. But you know, obviously we welcome that announcement. You know, as Graham, you mentioned, you think that's an important link in the incentive regime, and you both kind of touched on the fact that it's right now only in biotech and medical companies. You know, from a fintech context, you know, how do you think that this eventually could roll out, you know, to the fintech sector, Michael?
Well, I think in the same way that we see consumer data rights starting out testing, it's a very sensible way with this kind of you know, tax break and legislative move to encourage a certain kind of behaviour. Test it out in a very targeted area, figure out what's working and what's not working, see how people might be gaming the system, and then look to tweak it as it gets expanded. It's a very sensible way to move through. So this is, you know, for those who aren't aware of it, the patent box regime gets its name from the idea that you'll be able to tick a box on your tax return that you're taking advantage of this tax reduction to, I believe it's 17% for income derived from certain patents. Now, obviously, targeting biotech and medical, which are very patent-heavy industries already, lets it be a bit of a simpler approach. Fintechs historically aren't as patent heavy as medical and biotech. It's just the nature of the industry, but I think it will be expanded because Australia isn't quite at that American level of patenting at a broader way, but this is a huge incentive to try and keep IP in Australia and focus on getting Australian innovation through the patent system. Software patents are much more complicated in some ways because of the way that process can or can't be patented, but this gives a big incentive to say, well, not only should you consider doing those patents, you should consider doing it here. And that can address this issue that we've seen at the sort of more big tech space where you have IP living in offshore vehicles of various structures that get complicated and, in fairness, create an awful lot of work for accountants and lawyers. But at the end of the day, economically, maybe a lot more efficient to say, look, why don't you just leave it here, simplify things a bit, encourage it to stay here, keep people here. And we'll give you this concessional rate. So it's really good to see this to help reduce a little bit of, I suppose, arbitrage of people moving things around to more favourable areas tax-wise. But it really could have an impact and encourage more patenting, I think, around fintech. Graham, what do you think?
Oh, I think that's right. If companies are in a position where they'll be able to, if they know they've got an internationally competitive product, and they know they'll be able to generate significant offshore revenue, it really will be an incentive to attempt to consolidate that intellectual property and to leave it in Australia whilst they commercialise it internationally. It's an excellent regime.
And it's something that already is in UK, France, Netherlands has it. I think Spain has it as well. So this is not something that's super brand new. This is more of a catch-up, you might call it, to say let's do this. It's recognised as it's not a race to the bottom issue. It's much more of a look. This is a supporting Australian innovation, which we love to see.
Yeah, I think the government
the government realises that they're actually losing revenue in that successfully developed intellectual property in Australia is being moved to more tax advantaged locations, and we're missing out. And I think the government, this measure is a recognition of that. It's a very positive sign.
So some of my fintech clients, you know, they've traditionally looked to move offshore, you know, in terms of where they're doing their development. So I think this is going to be something that, although it's not necessarily applicable right now for fintechs, this is going to be a welcome change, you know, because I think what we don't want to see is all the development of the IP happening completely offshore and people structuring their companies to do that. So, I mean, I guess hopefully we'll go through, and obviously biotech, I work in a lot of biotech companies, so that's obviously a welcome change for the biotechs, and hopefully it will quickly come into the fintech space. So
I think it is important to note, sorry, I'll just jump on one point, that it's proposed to apply for patents that are applied for after 11 May 2021. So it's not a grandfathered scheme. So just to be aware of that. So it's more of incentivizing new patents, not trying to capture the old ones.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep, thanks for that, Michael. I know on the polling question, employee share schemes was the second most, the second biggest point that people wanted to talk about. I know Graham and Michael, we were talking before we jumped on the session that there wasn't a huge amount of significant changes, but Michael, do you have any particular comments just in terms of what happened with the last round of federal budget, and I guess maybe any views in terms of what do you think should change on a go-forward basis?
Look, I think it's great to see a reduction of what you might call red tape. Employee share schemes are still, particularly when you deal with startups, they're not something people want to spend a huge amount of time trying to get their head around, but they also are still painful enough to require a decent amount of work to both set up and administer. So I think the fintech industry and startup industry very much welcomes anything that's going to make it simpler. And we had some triggers of taxation that were probably not being possibly not followed, but certainly not desired at all, particularly where someone would leave their employment and have a taxation trigger event, which I don't think anyone really perhaps intended when it was brought in to make people have to potentially sell shares they'd received just because they've changed employment or have been made redundant or what have you. So simplifying the system in any way that reduces the cost and makes it faster for people to set this up and use it as a tool to help align incentives and give people that feeling of ownership, I think is really important. I think, Tim, you and I share the view that the ESS would just benefit from a whiteboard approach, from a task force getting together and saying, rightio, this is what we've had, these are all the benefits that have accrued over time and how it's been tweaked to work better, but let's take all that and redesign the whole thing from scratch with a view of making it really simple. If we could get the ESS down to almost an ESS box regime, like the patent box regime, to say, right, is this something that you can just tick a box in your tax return, fill in a simple number, and everything can run as automated as it possibly can from a regulatory perspective, that would turbocharge people using this, which I think would have massive benefits for a lot of businesses in getting that stickiness of employees staying because they're earning a piece of the business, which is really valuable. And I see that every day in a lot of businesses we advise. That really engenders people being interested, and even when they leave, they stay interested because they're a shareholder in the business. So it's a fantastic way, I think, to support things, but it's not going to be rewritten from scratch in a hurry. It might be more of a midterm goal that'll be reformed further.
Okay. Graham, any comments on ESS that you want to add or no?
Oh, no, I think the change was a fairly minor one, but a welcome one.
Yeah, I think, it's funny with a lot of fintechs, obviously, I think, and not surprisingly, they probably tick the box that it's of importance, because typically when you go talk to fintechs, this is a key issue or a key cost that's coming through as part of their business. So anything that could simplify it, or I was almost absconded at Intersect by some of the fintechs, in terms of if the rules could become simpler. And obviously it's a bit cost prohibitive, the way that some of these ESS schemes are kind of set up, in terms of probably misleading some of the financial statements just because of the big expense that's coming through. So I think in general, I think it'd be great to, Michael, as you said, whiteboard this to come up with a better way to do it, particularly for startups and innovative companies. So now maybe let's just move a little bit to the R&D tax incentive. And so I know, Graham, you've got a couple of slides, but maybe you can just walk us through some of the key changes that have happened in terms of the R&D incentive scheme.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, look, there's some really positive policy initiatives coming into effect from 1 July. It's fantastic. We'll start off with the small companies. So the sub 20 million turnover. The permanent difference will rise from the current 16%. From 1 July, it's 18.5%, which is as high as it's been since the mid 1990s. So there's been this. It was the benefit was eroded over time since the beginning of it, and it's gradually been picking up. 18.5 cents in the dollar is the highest it's been since the mid 90s, and I'm hopeful that it'll encourage greater investment in R&D. I'm sure it will. That increase in permanent difference stems from the reduction in the corporate tax rate from 27.5 to 25. But to its credit, the government left the rebate amount at 43.5%. So it is a significant benefit. And there's a heap of fintechs in startup mode who are availing themselves of the R&D tax incentive, and will continue to do so based on the new regime. For the large companies, there's actually a benefit for the large companies as well, which is you can pretty much put that down to the pandemic. The government was hell bent on reducing the benefits available to large companies. That's been turned around. They had a 5-tier structure initially put forward a couple of years ago. They've gone back to a simplified 2-tier structure. The intensity test is a flawed concept, but leaving that aside, there's a benefit to companies, and we just run with it. So that is a significant benefit to the larger companies, and providing them with a greatly increased incentive to invest in R&D. Just to give you an idea, in the following slide, there's an explanation of this intensity test. So they get the current 8.5 permanent difference is still around, but that only applies to intensity between 0 and 2% of cost. Just give you a quick rundown on the intensity test. It's a complex beast. There was a correlation made in various reviews between the proportion of companies' cost that they spend on R&D, and that somehow that they wanted to encourage companies who spent a greater proportion of their total expenditure. So what they do there, so between 0 and 2% in this example here, between 0 and 2%, you get 8.5. Anything over 2% intensity, you get 16.5 cents in the dollar. Now, in that example there, you've got total expenditure of the business of 10 million with R&D spend of $1 million. So their intensity is 10%. So that 10 million, 1% is 100 grand. And because, therefore, if 1% is 100 grand, 2% is 200 grand. So of their $1 million of R&D spend, 200 grand gets subject to the 8.5% permanent difference. The remaining 800,000 is subject to the 16.5% permanent difference. So in that example there, the net benefit to the company as a whole from its R&D claim is pushing 15 cents in the dollar. That 14.9 cents in the dollar is so that will be a significant benefit to that'll be a significant benefit to large companies. Other legislative changes, there's a cap. For large companies, the maximum you can claim the incentive on is 100 million. That's been raised to 150 million, which will help the sort of big end of town. There was some minor adjustment to feedstock provisions. They're complex, where you're producing goods and services not relevant to the fintechs, really. Innovation and science gave themselves a bit more power in terms of their decision making, not a great impact. And one that is interesting is the ATO will publish information on claimants. There's been stuff over the years, you know, people go, look, I know so-and-so who's a competitor who's getting, you know, some ridiculous amount. I don't know, maybe it's designed to encourage people to dob in their competitors. I'm not sure. I think, you know, I'm into transparency, so I think it's a good thing. So, but just be aware that the numbers there. Just in terms of generally issues, there's been a lot going on in the R&D tax incentive space. One of the new changes that comes in for the FY21 is there's a new administrative structure there's a new portal. Instead of lodging a fillable PDF, there's a new portal and a new form. Now, the form's focus has changed just to make it more onerous on companies who were accustomed to the previous arrangement. There's an emphasis in the new form on core activities. What is your core R&D activities, and sort of what was actually done, rather than sort of dealing with sort of eligibility broadly. There's also some interesting questions about documentation. Documentation's a live issue with R&D tax at the moment. And it is important. I'll stress to everyone that in conducting R&D activities, it's very important to maintain contemporaneous documentation in relation to the nature and extent of activities being conducted. Other recent developments, there's been some litigation outcomes which have provided some guidance, I suppose, and it's all been quite positive. There's also been some the two real areas of litigation. There was an AAT case called PKWK that came out a few months ago. A lot of the approaches that Oz Industry's been using to try to deny eligibility of activities were looked at in an AAT case, and the taxpayer in that case was successful. A lot of the approaches that had been applied were considered to be not appropriate, which is good. There was also issues on documentation. The AAT took a very practical industry sort of approach to the documentation requirements, which is good. One thing of particular relevance I did want to talk about before we move on is there has been a new draft guidance paper issued in late May on the eligibility of computer software development. So critical for fintechs. And I have to say, I commend the document to you. There's been some pretty ordinary approaches at trying to provide guidance on what the legislation actually requires over the past 4 or 5 years, but this one is heading in the right direction. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but I'd say significant progress has been made in this guidance paper. It does provide some interesting insights on eligibility, and it's getting very, very close to actually reflecting what the law is. I know it's very difficult for governments to put together guidance. The ATO is the problem with the rulings. Hard to have generalisations which are in all instances consistent with the terms of the Act. But I think this latest document they've had a good go, and I would commend that to people if they're preparing their claims. Have a read, and there is some quite good guidance in there, though not comprehensively good.
Step in the right direction.
Yes, step in the right direction, Michael. Very true, and which is overdue, but quite reassuring. Okay, so that sort of covers off on where we wanted to get with the R&D. I also, Tim, you wanted to have a chat about EMDG.
Yep, yeah. If you want to just run through EMG, that'd be good as well.
All right, no worries. 1 July is the beginning of a new regime for export grants. It has been a scheme which has provided a reimbursement of international marketing expenses, and the reimbursement has been on the basis of 50% rebate of eligible R&D spend. Now the basis of the scheme is changing. Much of it stays the same, but the fundamental basis of it being an open access scheme where people get a reimbursement based on their expenditure has changed. It's actually been turned from an open access reimbursement scheme to a discretionary grant scheme. If we just move on to the next slide, there we go. Interestingly, the justification for it was that businesses wanted certainty in relation to funds that will be received. The interesting thing about it is that uncertainty was totally imposed upon business by government to satisfy Treasury with a fixed output or a fixed cost of the scheme. which was introduced a few years back. So they've created the problem and then solved it by changing it to something that gives businesses less certainty. Classic stuff. The timing of they've said the timing of the payment, they wanted to give businesses certainty so they could know how much their rebate they're going to get in advance, and that's fine. But in doing so, what they've done is they've introduced a system where when businesses want to spend money, it is discretionary. They don't know whether they're going to get a grant or not, which is, to my mind, detracts from the scheme. But nonetheless, we run with it and see how it works out. In terms of how the scheme works, if we can move on. There's a similar arrangement. Companies can have up to 8 grants under the new scheme with a maximum payable of 770K over 8 years. Currently, there's a maximum of 150K over 8 years, 150K a year for 8 years. And they've split it up into tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So new exporters are in tier 1 and they can only get 40 grand a year. Tier 2, grow or expand, they can get 80 grand, or tier 3, further on down the track, they can get 150, which is the current limitation. And there is a system for industry bodies or whatever that's been maintained at tier 4, but from businesses, it's only really the first 3 tiers. And what you've got to do, if you can move on, the eligible products are exactly the same as what they were under the old open access scheme: goods, services, events, intellectual property, software. So if you're embarking upon an international marketing program outside Australia and New Zealand, remember New Zealand is part of Australia for export grant purposes at the Kiwis' insistence. So the activities that you want, or the goods or services that you want to promote, are exactly the same as they were. You can just, but what you have to do is you have to put up in advance what you want to spend the money on. We can move on. So there we go. Similar expenditure categories: the old overseas representation, marketing trips, consultancies, bringing foreign buyers to the country, provision of free samples, promotion and advertising material, the registration of intellectual property rights in offshore markets, training activities. As it says there in the slide, no longer there are caps. There used to be a cap on overseas reps and consultants. That's now been removed. So there's been some minor tinkering with the system. To be in tier 1, you've got to be ready to export, i.e. not previously exported, have appropriate skills in marketing. So they get some means by which they can preclude companies from claiming the tier 1s. Next one. Tier 2, this is seeking to grow and expand, 80 grand a year for maximum 3 years. And you need to, once again, it's at their discretion. You need to show the plan of what you want to spend and the plan of what you want to achieve, and they get to decide whether you get it or you don't. And then the next slide, the 3rd tier, this is really the level of assistance currently available under the scheme, the 150,000 a year. But this is for established exporters who want to make a strategic shift in your marketing activities, targeting a new market, targeting a different type of customer, launching a new product or service. So once again, it's like it's constraining access. And as I said, tier 4, the representative bodies, things like industry associations trying to assist their members into international markets, that's still covered by the scheme. So that sort of covers off on the export grants, Tim. It's providing certainty by instilling uncertainty into the regime.
Thanks, Graham.
I would also mention, sorry, one thing, the applications have to be invoiced. They open on 16 August, and for the FY22 year, they open on 16 August and close on 30 November.
Okay, thank you for that. And just for the people that are listening, we will share these slides. So if there's so you can look through some of that detail that sort of Graham provided. Michael, getting back to you a little, the budget, focus on a few other areas where it can be a bit more attractive to do business in Australia. One of the topics was the corporate collective investment vehicles scheme and the review of venture capital tax concessions. Maybe if you can just explain a little bit about what the corporate collective vehicles and how do you think this is going to enhance international competitiveness?
Thanks so much, Tim. Look, it's worth understanding that our managed investment regime is very specific to Australia. Overseas, most of them are called collective investment schemes. And our managed investment scheme came out of the amazing 80s. We had fabulous investments and dodgy haircuts, or sometimes the other way around. But the main point is that from that pre-digital world and fairly isolated world where, you got your passport stamped, it wasn't all electronic like it is nowadays when you were traveling, when we were allowed to travel. Everything was a lot more isolated and quarantined in a different way. So from that background, our MIS regime has trundled along. It came out of this prescribed interest idea in the early 80s, and it's been a very specific Australian thing. Its focus to date has been largely around unit trusts. So most people will be familiar with REITs, real estate investment trusts, and most of the managed investment schemes which are listed are all based around trust models, and the ones that are unlisted are all based around trust models, and that's for sensible tax reasons, because a trust has a flow-through effect. Obviously, lawyers and accountants, we know and understand and love trusts well. However, Australia, also with its unique history of being a British colony and picking up English law, has now seen things depart pretty significantly around how funds are managed and regulated in the entire Asia region, such that foreign investors coming in from Asia and China and the space, they don't recognize and understand how our trusts work. We have this attribution trust regime for dealing with certain tax aspects to try and push them through in a capital gains format, and rules around withholding, but they're all really tweaking an existing regime which is still alien to overseas investors. So we're sort of catching up from what should have been done a while ago, but the idea is to move away and create a regime that'll move away from a trust arrangement into a corporate sort of fund arrangement or a company-based model. So the idea would be that for Australian investors, it shouldn't really change what they're purchasing into, but it'll make things a lot more familiar to overseas investors, because we have this issue where Australia is considered to be a highly advanced financial area and with a very advanced fund system, but we have fairly low exporting of our funds. So for foreign investors to come in, and we have the Asia Passport Fund scheme. This is a move, and as I say, one that's been 12 years coming, to align ourselves better with the region and really encourage more foreign investment in Australia by just removing those blockers, so people will understand and say, oh, this looks like what I have at home. This looks like something I'm used to investing in, and hopefully get some streamlined approaches to things.
Yeah, I think that's going to be good, because I think you're right. I think, from a foreign investment perspective, I can speak freely because I'm an American coming into Australia. Some of the complexities with dealing with Australian rules and regulations are completely different from the rest of the world. So I think anything that can streamline this process will be received quite well. Particularly, given the stability of the Australian government and the economy, you're going to see a lot of people that are looking to try to invest into Australia. So hopefully we'll see some positive changes in that regard. I know we're quickly approaching our hour, so I just want to get some final thoughts from you guys. I guess, Graham, from your perspective, any words of advice for FinTech listeners that are out there in terms of what's going to be a priority for their success coming forward over the next year or so?
Well, I think if they can, in terms of from availing themselves of the tax benefits is to bring forward, if they can, capital expenditure. Just on that note, it's quite important how they treat that for tax purposes to maximise their R&D claim. There are approaches which enable fintechs to include that 100% write down in their R&D claim, but they need to make sure that that write down is under the appropriate tax provision. But that's that bring forward expenditure and get it written off as soon as they can.
Okay. And Michael, I guess I'll give you a tougher question. I guess in terms of, so, you know, if we look over the next 12 months, do you think Australia is going to crack the top 10 in terms of the, you know, Sydney moving into the top 10? Do you think Australia is going to continue to move up the league tables? You talked a lot about regulation. Do you think that some of those regulatory changes is going to lead to an improvement of competitiveness? And I guess what do you think the time period that you see that happening?
Thanks for the tricky question, Tim. I don't think it'll happen in the next 12 months is the answer. I don't think we're going to crack that further up. I think that when we have the kind of review we have, you know, we're going to have Bragg's report come out in October. There's already some reviews that were announced, you know, the ESVCLP review announced in the budget. There are things that take time with legislation. By design, it goes a bit slow. So there's a whole bunch of things that could be tweaked around, particularly the digital economy. I think the focus on the government putting money into it, there's just a bit of a, you know, a lagging indicator will be the success, but these things take time to spin up, people get settled in. It's not going to be something that sees flying results maybe towards the end of this financial year. I think that it's the following financial year where we really should start to see some fruit come from that, and that's when we have things like the collective investment scheme, corporate collective investment scheme coming into effect, and some other rules planned to kick off. So it's not this financial year, I think it's next financial year. So, you know, to add to Graham's point, I think this is when a lot of fintechs can really get that planning down pat to say, this is what's coming, this is what we can plan for. How can we tailor it in to get best financial advantage with the way that tax is going to work, get our houses in order quickly. You know, having just dealt with the tail end of the financial year, all professionals, even working from home in lockdown, have dealt with all those last minute things that happen. And at the risk of sounding like a school teacher, it's always like, yes, okay, new financial year, it's actually good to get cracking on the things that you want to deploy by the end of this financial year now, because you'll be able to get those things out of the way and not be rushing at them next June. So I think that's really important. And now we have clarity on a whole range of issues, and more clarity coming really helps with strategic planning. But it'll really take, I think, another 15 months to start to see that come through in massive benefits. But in the meantime, we already have the massive benefits of all of the digitization from COVID, and who knows if that will push us up the tables. I'd like to see it, don't know if it'll happen. So I'm not going to bet on it just yet.
Michael, I know you're a betting man, so I'll mark it down in the note, top 5 within 15 months. So I think probably kind of in summary, Australia is well placed. You know, there's been a lot of work that's been put in over the past few years. I think, you know, from a regulatory perspective and from a tax perspective, there's some welcome changes that are putting us on the platform to continue to improve. You know, and I think again, from an outside looking in, you know, people will be looking at Australia as doing fantastically well, just given the size of the country and how innovative the country is. So I think it's well done to the fintech community. This brings us to the end of.
Yeah, I think we should have a shout out. Yeah, having Jane Hume coming out saying we want these laissez-faire approach to new digital approaches to things, and that support is really like letting the free market do its job is really important. So that government support shouldn't be understated. That leadership from cabinet level there, it's quite clear that the government wants to just have a light touch where they can on a lot of regulation and not go too hard. And that gives that point of difference that people look in from the outside and are envious.
Yeah, and I think, and it's probably to that point, I've noticed the visibility, and probably because of COVID, you know, that they've been really engaged with a lot of these discussions, you know. So I know, Michael, we've been to a few different events, and you know, the government is making their presence felt. So I think it's I'm quite positive and bullish, you know, sort of on that fintech, you know, sort of outlook. So I guess watch the space, everyone, and we'll keep talking about it obviously as we go through the next 12 months. I wanted to thank, you know, Michael and Graham. This brings us to the end of the discussion, and appreciate your valued insights. And hopefully everyone agrees that this was a great session. You'll now see on the screen the details of our next webinars. We have a great lineup of topics and speakers this year, and we're going to be having Fintech Fridays up through December. Next month, we'll be diving into the world of InsurTech, which is going to be quite exciting and interesting. We've got Jason Wilby, co-founder and joint CEO of Open Insurance, and we've got Ali Bubble joining us, who's an insurance tax partner here at BDO as well. The details of this webinar will be shared with you in a follow-up email, including the slides. And if you've missed any previous webinars, we'll be sending out a link for those that would like to go back and listen to those. We'll also be including a short feedback survey so we can hopefully improve our Fintech Friday sessions as we continue to go forward. Thank you for joining today. Stay safe and have a great Friday. Thank you very much. Bye. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mark.